Hi everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and what we're going to be talking about is framing the reparations discussion. And there are two ways in which reparations might be framed, and one way is a restorative justice framework, and another way is a social justice framework, which is also a socioeconomic framework. Now, often these dynamics get conflated in the discussions, but it is actually very important that people make a determination about what framework they are going to use, because if you use a social justice framework, it's going to take you down one road, and if you use a restorative justice framework, which is a more legal framework, it's going to take you down a different road. And if you conflate the two, it's going to take you down a very confusing circular road. And the reason this happens is because there are different goals for restorative justice versus social justice. Restorative justice is a legal claim, whereas social justice is really more about social equality and this idea of social fairness and this idea of a balance, but it is not necessarily based upon an actual legitimate claim that anyone has. Now, of course, many are going to say that restorative justice reparations is about socioeconomics, and that is and is not true. Sometimes reparations it's not about socioeconomics. There are different ways to repair someone. But when you make it a purely socioeconomic framework, it again is going to take you down a different road. And so when you start to talk about things like creating equality, it's going to actually take you away from the restorative justice conversation, and it's going to open up a can of worms. And you might have noticed this when you hear candidates talking about reparations, because even they are mixing the two. And when they go down a social justice road, you might notice that there is a process of incorporation that goes on, and so it will start to include all sorts of people and all sorts of groups who do not necessarily have a restorative justice claim. And again, when you frame things in a social justice framework, then it is going to open up that can of worms. Or when there is a conflating of restorative justice and social justice or socioeconomic justice, you are going to have some difficulties that you might not have anticipated. And so we're going to look at the elements of restorative justice. We're going to look at the psychology that underpins both social justice frameworks in terms of reparations and restorative justice frameworks. And we're also going to touch on this issue of backlash, because a big part of the backlash that people are getting when they are discussing reparations is backlash related to what people are hearing related to social justice or the socioeconomics, that equality argument versus that restorative justice argument. And one thing to keep in mind in terms of the psychology of reparations is that when things are politicized, people tend to hear different things. And so what happens in discussions are related to reparations is people hear one of two things. When they hear restorative justice frameworks, they tend to see things in a national framework. When they hear a socioeconomic or equality argument, they tend to hear social justice. And for some people, social justice is a trigger word. It's a trigger phrase for them. And they tend to think that it is a global issue. And so just keep that in mind when you are thinking about discussing reparations. You keep in mind the audience and what they are hearing when the word reparation comes out and when the paradigm or the framework is discussed. And again, if it's restorative justice, many people are going to see that as a national issue. If it is framed as socioeconomics or equality for everyone, they are going to tend to hear social justice. They are also going to tend to hear global. And again, for some people, they have a paradigm in their head about what all of this means. And so it's important that you understand where people may be coming from when they are responding to questions about reparations. And you'll notice that when they respond, if you ask a question, whether you're talking about a candidate or just a person on the street, they are responding based upon one of these paradigms. And when they are responding based upon social justice paradigms, they will tend to be incorporative. And so you will hear the inclusion of other groups who do not necessarily have a restorative justice claim. Now, there are lots of discussions about reparations that are going on. These discussions have been going on for forever. But one of the things that needs to happen is that people are going to have to make a determination when you're talking about that ADOS reparations. People are going to have to make a determination about what type of claim they are advancing. And people need to be very clear about that. And so if people are making social justice, social equality claims, they need to be clear that that's what they are doing. But if they are really trying to advance a restorative justice claim, that needs to be clear. And those things should not be conflated. But what happens is when you insert things related to equality into the discussion, it throws it into that social justice, social equality camp. And so discussions about income disparity or wealth disparity, it is going to automatically throw the discussion into a camp that may be different from the restorative justice camp. And again, how you frame the discussion is going to determine how people respond to the discussion. So even the way that people answer questions about reparations, it will be determined based upon how they are understanding the claim. And if they are hearing a social justice claim, they are going to tend to give a social justice response, whether it is in the affirmative or whether it's some sort of rebuttal. The same thing that occurs with restorative justice. So if they hear a restorative justice claim, conversation, they are going to tend to respond in a restorative justice framework. And so unlike social justice claims, restorative justice is really about wrongs and being wronged and finding a link between the wrong and the damage and finding a causal link, and also pursuing of specific relief. And so it's really not about sort of this social justice equality type of dynamic. It is very, very specific. And if you get off of that specificity, you run the risk of actually ruining the claim. And so it requires being very, very specific. It only involves a certain number of people. It's very exclusive in its discussion and in its framework. And again, sometimes the conversations get derailed when politicians might be talking about reparations, or when, again, people just off the street might be talking about it. The conversation gets derailed as soon as someone starts to think about reparations in terms of a social justice framework versus a restorative justice framework. Now, we've talked about these issues to some degree in earlier videos from last year regarding restorative justice, but we're going to revisit it under this framework of understanding that there needs to be a distinction between social justice frameworks and restorative justice frameworks. And so when you're talking about restorative justice, gaps in wealth or income, none of that matters. The thing that really matters is the identification of a specific wrong. And so you have to have specified wrongs. And the wrongs that people are talking about in terms of reparation, you have chattel slavery wrongs, you have black code wrongs, you have Jim Crow wrongs. And that specificity needs to be there. One thing, though, that people might want to start thinking about is, are you all talking about different types of claims, sort of different types of roles? So if the argument is that you're talking about ADOS, for instance, if you are talking about the specific wrong must be chattel slavery plus Jim Crow versus chattel slavery and or Jim Crow, then you're going to have different groups of people that are making these claims. And so you might want to start thinking about how you are actually framing this class a little bit more carefully. This is important because I will tell you from research that the extent to which people are going to be able to trace their heritage to a specific enslaved ancestor who was enslaved in chattel slavery is going to be slim. Part of the reason for this is that many of the enslaved individuals were not always listed by name. And so even when you look at census records, there may be an indication in terms of perception of race. However, there was not always a name. And so many people who are trying to identify ancestors may be having a very difficult time locating these ancestors who were involved in victimized by chattel slavery. Another thing to be considered is this issue of inclusion and exclusion. If you do not include chattel slavery and or Jim Crow wrongs, you're going to diminish that class, and so you're going to diminish your foundation. The other group that you need to be concerned about are what are considered quote-unquote Black Indians. If that group is excluded, then it's going to take away a significant foundation. And as people start to do research on their ancestry, which people should be doing if they are thinking about being a part of an ADOS class, one of the things that people will discover is that a number of those individuals who were their ancestors, who were involved in slavery or who might have been enslaved, many of those ancestors will be identified as Black or Negro Indians. And what you also may find is that you have ancestors who were not involved in slavery at all. There were large numbers of what were called free persons of color. Those individuals were free persons of color, and they may not have been enslaved. However, they did not escape Jim Crow. And so again, you want to think carefully and strategically about how you are creating this legal class. Who is going to be included and who is going to be excluded. And if groups are going to be excluded, that probably needs to be made clear, because some people are probably not understanding that, so that people can make determinations about how they want to proceed. Okay, so the other thing is that you are looking for not just specific wrongs, but specific harmed classes. And so that's what we just talked about. And so you are looking for two classes primarily: direct victims of slavery, Black codes, and Jim Crow, or lineal descendants of chattel slavery, Black codes, and Jim Crow in terms of the victims. Also looking to see, you have to identify who the perpetrators of wrong might be, and what the causal connection is to the specified damages. Are you talking about perpetrators that happen to be public or private, foreign or domestic? Slavery spanned a significant amount of time, and there were a number of players in this dynamic. And so you did have public and private and foreign and domestic. And another thing that you might want to start to think about is the idea of contribution. And so even though the pursuit may be, in terms of reparations, one entity, it might be prudent to start thinking about the suggestion of contribution from the other contributors to the wrong, and those would be entities that might be private, foreign, and domestic. And so that might be other sovereigns. So it's something to think about in terms of framing this restorative justice claim. And before we jump into damages and relief, one thing that is important to make note of and start to think about is this need for creating a role. We've been talking about this creation of roles for quite a while. The reason why it is important to think about and begin the creation of roles is because you need to have specific numbers. Sometimes people think you can just, sort of pull numbers out of the census. There are so many people in the United States and so many people who might presumably be descendants of these experiences. However, you need to have specific numbers, or as specific as possible, because when you have the specific numbers, then you can start to talk more specifically about the damages. So you can more specifically talk about monetary and non-monetary damages. And what follows from an understanding of the exact nature of the monetary and non-monetary damage is a discussion of restoration, relief, restitution, and that needs to be directly tied to the damage. And so it can't be, or it shouldn't be, things that are just sort of out there in the air. It needs to be this particular type of damage occurred, and this is the particular relief that is tied to the particular damage. And the same thing goes for non-monetary damage. And so it would be, this is the particular damage that occurred, and this is the particular action that would result in relief, restitution, or restoration. And one of the things that people will find reparations being attacked for is not making that linkage. And so people do need to see that linkage, and people need to understand the linkage. Okay, we've been talking about the legal framework, the legal understanding of restorative justice. And now we're going to talk about some of the psychological dynamics that take place when the framework is a socioeconomic equality framework in terms of reparations. And what tends to happen is that there is an emotion-focused backlash when reparations is framed under that socioeconomic equality paradigm versus that restoration paradigm. Okay, so far we've been talking about the legal construct of restorative justice. There is another way that people understand reparations, and it is often from a social justice framework, as we've been talking about. The difference is when you're talking about restorative justice, people tend to see that in a purely legal framework. When you are talking about social justice, however, or you're talking about creating social equality, what happens is that people start to see the reparations discussion from a political standpoint. Now, of course, you can't really divorce the politics from the law, but it is important to understand how people are hearing things when they are hearing these different frameworks. And so when individuals hear the restorative justice framework, they're going to respond a particular way. When they hear the social justice or the social equality argument, what they are going to do is they are often going to put that in the category of democratic socialism. And when they put it in the category of democratic socialism, they are going to have a more emotional response to it. And they are also going to tend to see the discussion of reparations as one that is related to welfare. They are going to see the discussion as one related to handouts. And the other thing that happens when it is framed in a democratic socialist framework is that it's going to inadvertently invite other groups to make claims for equality. You saw this in cases related to, call it the Bakke-Bollinger-Fischer era. You saw this happen. And so what many people thought should be an affirmative action dynamic turned into a quote unquote diversity dynamic. And so when you change something from a purely legal framework and you put it over into the social justice camp, it is going to inadvertently invite the claims of other groups. It's going to invite discussions of other groups that don't necessarily have restorative justice claims, but they do have claims for this framework of equality. And so you have to be careful about how you are framing reparations, because as soon as you step out of that legal framework and you jump into a socio-political discussion of reparations, it's going to take it down a road that you might not be prepared to go down. And you saw that happen in Bakke-Bollinger-Fischer. Another thing that happens simply because of the history of social movements is that some people are going to automatically think that the reparations discussion, which is a restorative justice discussion, they may see it as a smokescreen for other democratic socialist programs. And so you saw this in situations like Black Lives Matter, how it starts off presenting as one thing and then it is eventually presented as something else. The same thing with the Me Too movement or issues related to immigration. And so you really do need to be careful about how you are framing the reparations discussion. If you take it out of that social justice framework and you put it into the restorative justice framework, you're going to have different outcomes. And you're also going to have different responses from political figures who are discussing reparations, particularly if you're talking to a political figure who has a legal background. If they have a legal background, it's probably very beneficial to keep them in that legal framework versus taking them into that social justice framework. One of the things that happens when you change the framework from a restorative justice framework to a social justice or socioeconomic equality argument is that you run the risk of people making the argument that all equality matters, all socioeconomic equity matters. And so what you end up with is a social emotionality. And you also will start to venture down the road of Bakke-Bollinger-Fischer, where affirmative action initiatives ended up turning into diversity initiatives. And this happened in large part in order to pass constitutional muster, because as soon as you start using reparations as a social equality dynamic, what ends up happening is that constitutional issues are going to come up and people are going to start to assert equal protection. And if you cannot get past equal protection, you're going to have some problems. That does not happen with restorative justice, however. Restorative justice is just that. It is restorative justice. And it really has nothing to do with diversity or affirmative action. And so again, you want to be very careful about going down a slippery slope. It may sound like a great idea to bring up equality issues because equality is underpinning this whole dynamic. But in terms of a framework, it is important to stick to the legal framework versus the social justice framework. And for this reason, in an upcoming video, we're going to talk about questions that should be asked when talking with people about reparations. And sometimes the question is the most important thing, and how that question is framed, and how you get that conversation started, and how you keep the conversation from being derailed, going down the road of affirmative action and diversity 2.0. Because you have to remember, restorative justice is not about diversity. Restorative justice is about a legal claim. You have a specific identified wrong, you have a harm, you have causation, you have damage, you have that relationship. And social justice is not necessarily about that. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.